Hello.
So cool. So on the
Am I
motion, this
audible?
House-based feminists in Peru should prioritize seeking accountability for Peru's forced sterilization campaign over campaigning for other major contemporary sexual or reproductive rights. Yeah, PM whenever you're ready.
Oh, wait, perfect. Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, perfectly audible. Cool. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech and invite opposition to start opposition bench for your opposition whenever they're ready.
Am I audible?
Audible and visible.
Kill. POIs in verbally, please. Okay. Okay. Starting my speech in three, two, one. I can scarcely imagine the horror that the women of Peru experienced between in that decade where they had to suffer under the program's sterilization, the men as well. But I think, unfortunately, this is a particularly grim glimpse into a history of oppression, marginalization, and abuse that a lot of minority communities have experienced. I think the salvo, the priority, the raison d'être of any movement is to solve the underlying condition, not lick our wounds. A few things on definition and framing then. First of all, in terms of what strategy is available to us, I think in terms of advocating for reproductive rights, it's obviously up to the movement itself what kind of policies it wants to advocate for. And therefore, they can kind of modulate their policies in relation to what is kind of palatable within Peru as a whole. This is to say that we don't necessarily always have to take the most extreme position. The fact that they're a conservative country does not mean that they're allergic to issues of women's rights, right? Like there are a lot of very like conservative reasons why you would support a lot of the basic policies of these in terms of what they mean, for example, for human dignity, if you want to take like the Christian perspective on this. The second thing is, I just want to note that empirically reproductive rights are utile, right? Like the major changes that the that Plan B or the pill have done for women's rights to not only have agency over their body, but also within the political sphere that surrounds them cannot be understated. And we'll be dealing with this case. Firstly, then, though, on why this means greater buy-in, because I think there is an attempt to do this from government. We're going to clash with this quite directly. First of all, I just want to note why this means that more people buy in the moment. They say that this is a rather urgent thing to do, but they never explain why this is a utile outcome. And therefore, I can think that this is something that would be just to be pursued in theory, but not necessarily that this would benefit me in any way. Therefore, when I am making my priorities in terms of what I'm going to support with my own material sacrifices, the things that are very necessary for any liberationary effort, whether or not I go to marches, to protests, whether or not I put myself in any dangers for the benefit of the people who are around me, who are fighting with me in this movement, I have to believe that I have personal stake in it. And unfortunately, they provide you with no reasons why this is the case. They say that overall you tend to support things like indigenous people's rights and the poor people's rights, and this is not unfair, but this is not a policy that particularly helps them or moves them out of their positions. Their argument would have to be on why people do not prioritize the material aspects of themselves, and I just don't think this is true. I think when you have faced suffering, when you've been impoverished, when you've been disenfranchised, the first thing in your head is who's going to give me the most optimal spaces for my survival. Secondly, I just want to note that this is more beneficial to the people who actually don't care as much about this, right? Because regardless of, even if you're a guy, right, you still have a like daughter or a wife or a mother or a sister or a friend who would practically and tangibly benefit from these policies. You do not have the same proximity in terms of anything else, and therefore, when you're asked to make prioritization about who you would be supporting, the thing which actually means something to you in any close sense would probably be the reason why you would be acting. I'm going to explain why this prioritization is important in a second. They go, but you get fragmentation. I just want to note that they provide us with no reasons why this is only true about our side of the house. They go, again, they have this like overarching amount of interests that are included in their case, but like this, the same thing is true for just reproductive rights in general, right? The second thing is, I would argue fragmentation is not that bad. A multiplicity of voices in terms of what to do with people's agency towards their reproductive rights is probably something that is important to have. They never explained to me why this is bad, especially when it means that like even if we disagree on some things, I'm still gonna vote for the candidate that broadly supports my reproductive rights policies if those have been explained to me. Cool. What is the impact then? I don't think that the impact is whether or not you buy in. I think people buy into the feminist movement for like internally why they believe it for a lot of reasons which are completely non-related to this motion. But the policies that they push for is going to inspire the specific behavior that you want to see towards this movement. When you believe that they are doing something practical for your own benefit, then you have more of a reason to have a more intense participation in the movement for all the reasons that I explained above. But secondly, more duration, because as soon as that problem is fixed, as soon as the reparations are given out in any sense, then their sort of movement kind of starts to lose steam, right? Because you've won the war instead of just one individual battle with many battles to come. Cool then. Why is this important? First of all, more movement generally speaking, but secondly, I think it leads the Overton window to shift somewhat, right? Now you're starting to have this conversation about actual reproductive rights and all of those things. But on the substantial stuff, why this is materially better for the lives of people who engage. The reason for this is quite simple, panel. Your ability to participate in politics is contingent on your reproductive health and your right to your bodily autonomy. There's a lot of obvious reasons why this is true, because women frequently find themselves in a position where they are unable to have control over their own lives because of the rules that are imposed on their body. Because at the point where you accidentally get pregnant, or at the point where your own body has become violated, you are then obliged to carry the child that is going to ultimately constrain your ability to participate in politics in the future, the ability to advance your own self-actualization and to become the person that you were meant to become. Even when it is not this severe, there are a lot of initial steps that we are missing out on, a lot of the prevention that could otherwise go into protecting a lot of people's lives in a very practical manner, right? Their ability to know how to use proper protection during sex when the children inevitably have premarital sex, right? Like this is going to happen without ruining their fucking lives, avoiding STDs, or just generally keeping themselves safe in comparison to the world around them. On the comparative, I just want to note why there is very clear lack of utility in opening government. The first thing is to say that reparations would be given on an individual basis. It wouldn't be given to everybody, so they already just don't affect the vast majority of people. But secondly, the scale of this impact is not particularly intense. I can agree that I did something wrong. I don't think I should give you enough money to completely upend your fucking life. Like if I give you £1,000 or £100,000, I've still technically fulfilled my obligation that I provided you with a reparation. At the point where you make this a financial cost and people are likely to oppose to it, bringing the benefit that you gain down to a fucking absolute minimum. But there's no way to have a sort of given rights to an abortion, right? Maybe they constrain it to 6 weeks, maybe they constrain it to 8, but like that is a substantial difference, more so than a small amount of money would be. Why are we able then to make this prioritization? I think four reasons. The first, the prioritization being towards the people who are currently alive and who would benefit from these practices. The first is that you have a reparatory obligation to them. These are the people who participate in your movement, the people who fund it, the people who fight for it, the people who put their fucking bodies on the line. You have an obligation towards those bodies, towards ensuring that they are safe and able to live the maximal amount of life possible. Secondly, that this is a utile thing to do, because the more you lose people to the constraints that society puts on them, the more they are unable then to participate in the political scene, to make their own voices heard. The third and the fourth is the stuff that I mentioned above, that this is just a clear win on the matter of scale and on the matter of intensity. This is to say, panel, not only has opening government not provided us with sufficient reasons why this is the most utile thing that you should be going for, they haven't even explained why this prioritization is something that you are obliged to do. There is something about urgency there, but I'm not sure why this exists in an issue that has existed for 30, 40 years. The fact that there might be a statute of limitations does not mean that what the state did not do is not wrong and therefore you should be paid. But the thing that matters particularly now is people's lives and their ability to participate in politics. For those reasons, please vote opening opposition.
I thank League of Opposition for a fine speech. Remind speakers feel why it's been important about the game to offer, ask them to take some helpful engagement and factors into close decisions. With that being said, the EPM to summarize opening government's case whenever they're ready.
Speech will start with my first word. Rural indigenous women in Peru see feminism as complicit with Fujimori, who used family planning as pro-women messaging and used it to sterilize millions of women. In those instances, when you just suddenly get a win from the International Court of Human Rights and you suddenly stop talking about it and push for reproductive rights for people who are not even in middle class in cities, who are educated elites, you are seen as someone who's once again denying the agency of these women on the ground. We think such a movement is bad. First, let's chat about this. One, we don't have to give up everything we have done for reproductive rights. This is often a generational struggle. It takes place across many years. This grassroots movement is built around. It's a prioritization debate. So we still keep the same sort of media support. We still keep the same old cases we have been fighting, and we keep on fighting. The debate is about what is the new banner boards that your protest going to be about? What is your current media coverage going to focus on? Is it going to focus on Fujimori, or is it going to focus on abortion rights and success? What is your current lawsuits lawsuits and extra lawsuits that you're fighting, and news and coverage going to be about. This is going to be about Fujimori on our side, and the new stuff has to be on them. Let's first chat about small window and why the small window claim matters. First, this happened in 1990s. There are three implications that come out of this. First, your existing victims are getting older and dying out. The reason for this is important is because they are less willing to appear publicly. They cannot give testimonies. They cannot go to courts and be able to cover in media and say that we were denied all of this help across millions of years, that we were forced sterilized, that we got infected and we died in these instances, which means that your court cases become worse and worse. The reason you only get reparation for Celia Ramos and no one else is because there's lack of evidence, and it keeps going smaller and smaller as more and more people die. But two, perpetrators and government officials who are painted as demons who did this policy, who spearheaded this policy, also become older and die. So you're not able to campaign and mobilize people against specific figures who need to be punished, because when they are dead, all of the movement momentum goes away. But third, Vardhan likes to PUI and say this is empirically false, but you should read a newspaper. There's an amnesty law that was passed last year by Fujimori, who comes and talks about, for example, protecting the people. The crimes that happened before 2005 were not crimes that can be punished in any reasonable regard. So before you use the word empirics, please go and read a newspaper in this regard. The implication of all of this analysis is this happened back in time. If you don't fight now, you won't be able to fight in the next 10 years. You'll be seen as having failed these group of people over a longer period of time. But on the comparative, why are you likely to be successful on our side of the house? First, you have a recent win on International Court of Human Rights. Ashyln tells you that Celia Ramos win is great. One, because you have international order for Peru to pay reparation to only one person, by the way, not everyone, not all the 500,000 people. But Peru is still pushing against it. They still haven't given speaking and enforcing. But it's important because this happened just now. There's coverage all across the world. So there's momentum. You're covered in news. You can piggyback of this to a large extent. You can file cases, you can go and talk to victims, and you can use the news. Economist is interested in talking to you, and international NGOs and news media is interested in talking to you. So when they have limited trade-off capacity to work with you, now is the time that they'll come to and talk to you, so we increase the total number of media coverage that you get as Peru feminists, as you would get on the counterfactual, which means we have an additive claim here. But this is also important because you are able to get some win on this regard, right? This is important because motivation is important for mobilization. Movement fatigue in social movement, especially in a thankless place like Peru, is real. As you don't get any wins, as you work for 30, 40 years and you don't get any win on reproductive rights, people start to dissipate out of the movement. The movements get smaller, and as movement gets smaller, other people start showing up because you're the only person showing up for the protest. So when you get some win, when you see that your feminist movement is doing something, this aspect of success, this is what retains people in the movements. This is what makes the people in the city stay, because they see that they're changing something meaningfully, that they got reparation for one or two more victims, and that means people are more willing to be radical. But this is also important because your opposition party is now listening to you. As they see you as a political figure, someone who's covered by media, someone who's on the news, you're seen as a bigger voting bloc, so you're politically more important. The implication of all of this is that we get some solvency and some wins. I'm unsure what the counterfactual is. How do they get no change in the landscape where you don't even have abortion access for things like rape in general after 30 years of effort? How do you change that in any meaningful way? There's no mechanism. At least we have some mechanism and momentum to work off. Let's weigh this. A couple of things here. First, we get justice for 500,000 indigenous women. Even if we get reparations for some more of them, that's physical money and cash injection you provide to their family. Many of them struggle and got infections, died due to poor administration. Their family gets catharsis. That money can be used to their children and they can actively benefit of this. This is important because this is tangible benefit compared to ops fake movement politics claim. But two, this also deters governments across the world to not intervene in the rights of citizens. So this is about all the other countries that could be the Fujimori government tomorrow. And seeing that you get reparated for these things is an implication for other governments to be more careful about family planning issues and what happens. I'll take CEO.
So what reparations are actually proportional to all the suffering that you outlined, especially if by your own concession, most of these women are now elderly, if not dying?
There are some of them who will get reparations. Their family, they have kids. If I die from infection, my kids suffer for a longer period of time because no one's providing for them. I don't think your claim makes any sense. Second, in terms of legal infrastructure, Ashyln tells you that this is something you can base your legal foundation of reproductive rights on. Right now in Peru, you see that birth begins at conception. That is the notion around which you're constitutionally bound, which is why it's very hard to legally change the infrastructure. At least when you push this, you're able to push a legal notion that the state cannot interfere in the reproductive rights of women. So you get a non-interference claim that you can build around this milestone case. And that is what you can build case lawsuit upon. So yeah, maybe you're not able to expand reproductive access, but you're able to at least prevent the state from later intervening, and that becomes some notion of reproductive protection over a long term, and that becomes a mechanism, a foot in the door through which you can increase legal protections for women in the long term. So we also get this more. But finally, on fragmentation and rural support, first, on your side of the house, rural women don't support feminist figures in general. They've historically distrusted them. Many times these feminist women saw family planning and hailed it as good for being women, that women don't have to bear the load of childbirth when they are like sterilized to a large extent. So rural women don't support your feminist movement. They see you as elitists. They historically have been central to mass protests, but every day they come less and less. If feminism is now able to gain this block, if more and more rural women are listening to feminist figures, that's how you become politically important. That's how you can do grassroots feminism. And this is important because the most women that you want to help, they want to give like access to, are women in the rural area. These are women who need safe spaces. These are women who need like support from things like physical abuse, etc., that happens in family. We get these women in the movement. We provide them the safe spaces. On your side, they're deterred from joining the movement because they see you as elitists. They see you as complicit in the murder and sterilization of all of you, and therefore you get fracturing. You just have middle class people. You don't even have moral purity. I don't know what is the moral infringement your movement is based upon.
I thank DPM for fine speech and invite DLO to summarize top half whenever they're ready.
Three quite simple things in the speech. Firstly, why opening government don't achieve their objective. Secondly, why we get broader buy-in on our side of the house. Thirdly, the massive scale of benefits we get from achieving even one of our policies. Firstly, why they don't achieve their objective. I have three separate things on this. Firstly, politicians push back far more against their policies, i.e., by making by giving rights to women, you don't lose anything as a politician. But definitionally, if you're being prosecuted, you risk going to jail and spending the rest of your life there, having your career and your life destroyed. And notably, opening government make the concession that many of those who were involved in the 1990s are around now and are the ones who are restricting the capacity for people to seek reparations. This is also objectively true, either because many of the people who are in power at the moment, or in power in different ways, began their careers under Fujimori in the 90s, or were mentored by them, or had family members who propped them up and via nepotism put them into power who were around in the 90s, and so have a huge incentive to protect those who began their careers. This is the greatest form of objection that you get from politicians because it's the most personal sort. But even if you don't buy that, there tends to be a very big backlash to allowing any forms of prosecution, because politicians right now who engage in things like corruption want to set the precedent that the prosecution of politicians in future is very, very difficult, so to reduce the chance that they themselves are prosecuted. Thirdly, reparations aren't that popular, i.e., if it's a reasonable amount to repair the cost of sterilization, let's say it's equivalent of $10,000 or something like this. Over 200,000 people, this is a lot of money. And it's a lot of money that like other people in Peru lose access to government spending from. So there's a lot of people who want to spend $3 billion on this when it could be saving cost of living, like it could be going into education or healthcare, things that benefit them as individuals as well. So it's hard to get the buy-in. The claims you get from opening government on capacity are twofold. Firstly, there's been a recent court decision that has allowed this. I would say this implies two things, actually. Firstly, the degree to which it's very difficult to get any action from court decisions, given the Peruvian government is still refusing to follow through. I get no analysis as to why you then change that. And secondly, there is more international NGO buy-in. Again, I see no reason why international NGOs are sufficient to convince politicians to give up their mentors or even them themselves to the possibility of prosecution. Secondly, then, on buy-in, I want to note buy-in is incredibly important to achieve any kind of feminist goals, because I think feminism is or the feminist movement is inherently biased built around buy-in. The way you convince a vaguely left-wing politician to side with you is you say, well, we can guarantee you people at your rally. We can guarantee you voter turnout by driving people to the polls. We can guarantee you fundraising because our members will donate money, or simply because you have large numbers of feminists who are engaging with media, who are talking to men, or who are talking to more centrist or more conservative women and convincing them of the justness of their cause. I think two things there. Firstly, the base that opening government want to talk about, which feminism is brought into, I don't think were the women who faced the sterilization in the 90s. It's difficult to say, but I think one, these can be much younger women who may not have even been alive or very, very young in the 90s, because younger people tend to engage in these movements much, much more. They don't have obligations like jobs and family. And secondly, they tend to be wealthier and more powerful women, those who are able to access education, who had more access to spare time than others to engage in the feminist movement. And these are people who are less likely to be targeted by the regime in the 90s. So this base, which is incredibly important, probably fall more on our side of the house, because these people see a far more direct benefit that they're engaging with. Secondly, though, they say that you're going to get the buyout of the indigenous population. Panel, I think the indigenous population benefit quite a lot, or poor women benefit quite a lot from policies on our side of the house, from the control of your own body, from good sex education that prevents abuse, or from things like maternity pay or reductions in discrimination based on whether you have children. But the more overriding factor in abuse is far more simply, you're just more likely to benefit as a woman on our side of the house, because our policies benefit, well, 50% of the population, millions. I think, I can't remember the exact proven population, but I think tens of millions of women rather than just 300,000. And at the point where you have to give up your time, your money, maybe even take personal risks to engage in a movement, as much as you might be incredibly sympathetic and empathetic towards women who suffered under sterilization, are you going to give up that immense suffering of yourself for something that you gain no direct benefit or your daughter gains no direct? I think that's far harder to argue for. And similarly, the same is true of men. I.e., you're much more likely to see men who see their daughter or their wife benefiting from this increase in rights on our side of the house, where there's a far less more likely to be related to or on a day-to-day basis engage with women who would benefit from the policy on the open government side of the house. For these reasons, then, I think we'd win the buying clash. Finally, then, on the direct benefits we access via our policy. I want to note, I just think general reproductive rights and benefits are incredibly important. The feeling that you have a fundamental control over your own biology and your own body, that the most important decisions that most of us make in our lives, whether to have children or not, is your decision and is an informed decision and is an incredible right, an incredible thing for a person to bear or have to bear not having control of. I think there's just very direct utilitarian outcomes. Firstly, on things like abortion, the idea that you don't have to have your life destroyed, your career and your life ripped away from you, the fact you have to raise a child that you don't think you have the capacity to care for, or the medical harm that is going through a pregnancy, which can be incredibly physically harmful towards you, or even worse, the empirical fact that huge amounts of women, when they don't get legal access to abortion, go to the illegal, incredibly dangerous black market operations that endanger the health of you and the child as well. And notably, I don't think we entirely flip abortion on our side of the house, but they say Peru is conservative. Every country is conservative at some point. Clearly, the feminist movement has made steps over time by convincing men, by making these campaigns, by making legal suits. And even if it is small iterations, i.e. getting protections for women who have unconsensually been impregnated, I think it's a big step. But I think even the lower burden things on our side of the house still produce pretty big benefits. Sex education gives you the autonomy to know what actually happens with your body, what will get you pregnant, what happens when you get your period, what kinds of contraception you can access, and in fact gives you access to that contraception itself so you can make informed decisions and choose whether you have children and things like this. It also limits abuse at the point where you know what safe and respective sex is, and this is not defined for you by the first man that you sleep with. Similarly, I just think other things. Actually, before I go into the other things, I'll take closing favor, I think.
OG?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, Mesh.
Uh, Even if you have things like sanitary access, a lot of women in rural areas don't want to access it through the government or the feminist movement because they don't trust them. How do you solve for this trust calculus on your side?
I genuinely do think most will engage in it at the point where it is just a very direct utilitarian benefit for them and they will overcome it. I also think this is usually done by localized groups or localized governments who are more trusted. Finally, then, just things like maternity leave and discrimination based on motherhood, restricting these things or giving them maternity leave in that case allows you a preservation of a good life even once you have your reproductive functions run out. What's the weighing on these two claims then? Firstly, it just benefits vastly more people, tens of millions versus hundreds of thousands. So even if you think the open government claim is somewhat better, is it 100 times better? Really? Similarly, you can't turn back the harm, i.e. we can't undo the sterilization. We can't take back the trauma that people have suffered in opening government, no matter what reparations or even assuming they achieve all of their goals. But we can prevent the trauma that comes from an unwanted pregnancy or from sex that you don't understand and don't have control over because you were never educated in it. That is an active prevention of trauma rather than a small mitigation. I think this is far better than the urgency weighing we get in opening government. Because firstly, I think all the things I talk about are very urgent for women in this moment. Like if you get these things 5 years earlier, that's 5 years and hundreds of thousands of women who feel it's very urgent for them to have those things. But also the urgency weighing from opening government is also pointing out why this is the hardest time to happen. This is the active point in which there is the most government pushback against it, so they're very difficult to achieve their objectives. Panel, I think there's a tragedy on both sides of this house. I think the greatest tragedy is the one that women suffer every day in their millions in Peru, and it's that we seek to overturn in the opening opposition.
I thank the yellow for a fine speech and everyone's top been a good debate so far. Time for the back half member of government whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
And visible, yeah.
That's great, thank you. I'll take POIs verbally, please, if you have any. In our top half, the issue is with our opening is that they say reparations are good, but they don't say where reparations actually happen. They tell you that accountability means reparations. However, accountability takes place in many different forms. Our case is lower burden, more impactful, will fill the gaps in our opening, will win this debate. However, out of opening opposition, there's one thing we have to respond to: the claim that these policies benefit the entire population. Very important thing to note: Peru is in Latin America, which the majority of Latin American countries are very often very deeply Roman Catholic. The constitution is Roman Catholic. The average person hold deeply Catholic, Roman Catholic viewpoints. What does this mean? It means the average person does not care or will not utilize the policies being put in place in the first place. Abortion clinics are being used by modern hippie kind of people. The average Peruvian Catholic does not care about abortion clinics in the local area. They will oppose them. And if they happen, they will not use them. Very importantly, the preemptive response was that, hey, all countries are Catholic. Again, Peru is a Roman Catholic nation. Not sorry, they said all countries are conservative. Peru is a very deeply more conservative country than the average country in the world. This means that their policies will not be used by the average person, even if they work in the first place. Firstly, on the extension, why is accountability easy to access on our side? 5 main reasons. Number 1, they manifest in numerous forms. How does this manifest in Peru? We say it can form the demonizing politicians, demonizing parties, ensuring this doesn't happen again by pushing on social media, saying, hey, this party did bad things to our community, meaning that they can push on the minor issues on social media and make it a large-scale issue on the Peruvian media scale. This uniquely means that our opening has a really high burden. We say that even if we just demonize some people, if we can drum up enough hate towards certain politicians, we can win over our opening. Second of all, men were involved in this harm. Very, very importantly, Peru is deeply patriarchal, as many countries in Latin America are, meaning that the harms of these individuals, men, may even be more impactful to the interests of the population than that of the women. This means that men will buy in to the movement to a greater extent because these men were harmed. My brothers in Peru, in the villages, were harmed. Therefore, I care about it more because I might dislike women. I'm not care about women's rights at all. If men were harmed by the government, I now dislike men even more. Comparatively, abortion clinics are very detached from the average issue of men, the majority of the population. They don't really care about what the sexual health clinics in schools are. They care about seeing their own brothers and sisters do well in society. This means the average person buys into it more. It's more emotionally salient to them. They care about it on a deeper level. Thirdly, the idea of having your ability to have kids taken away from you is very deeply emotional, a very salient topic, a very visceral image being created on social media, a visceral image on the TV shows you have in Peru. This means that, first of all, it will dominate the news cycle. If people care about it more often because it's sitting deeper in your mind, it's a very deeper issue on the Peruvian scale. Secondly, it dominates social media. Social media relies upon extreme imaging, like very deeply emotional and popular topics. If it's more popular over a longer period of time, people understand it more. They care about it more as a result of it. Comparatively, again, mental and sexual health clinics and sexual health education is very, very detached from the average person. It's significantly less visceral than the image of having your right to have kids taken away from the government. Fourthly, family support to a larger extent. Men and women were harmed, and reparations go to families overall. Meaning entire families push the government for change. On one side, a feminist could be a mother and she has 3 kids, a husband who don't really care about the same issue. On our side, everyone in the family buys into this one movement. Everyone in the family supports and pushes the government to do this thing. Fifthly, it's a class buy-in issue. As in, poor people in small poor communities were harmed by this. Meaning that the average poor Peruvian who sees their brothers harmed by their government, their working class brothers and sisters being abused by the rich government of Peru, they will care about it more. There's a greater class buy-in among the lower classes of Peru into the movement overall. The downstream impact of this, firstly, we fill the gap in our opening. But additionally, we tell you that accountability happens no matter what. Even if you buy in the entirety of op-eds and you say that, hey, government change is pretty hard to achieve. We say that even if we can just demonize certain people, we can demonize political parties, we can ensure this doesn't happen again by holding those accountable amongst the population. We say that we can beat our opening, we can win this debate. Second extension, why do we reshape discussion around the place of men in society in Peru? But 3 main reasons for this. Number 1, the harms are very deeply tied to patriarchal oppressions, and there are very visible harms you can see in Peru. As in, you can very easily go out and see, even if people have died to some extent, the images are still there. The pictures, the stories that they've held in newspapers, in old magazines, are still existing on the Peruvian web somewhere. I mean, you can very easily see the difference you can have of these people in society. Second of all, you make men more aware of their place they hold. For example, if this issue is of men who were in power at the time, men who were in the government government at the time, pushing their ideas, pushing these evil policies onto certain women and children in certain parts of Peru. This means that these people, the average man, will now understand, hey, I hold a lot of power. I can vote these guys into power when I was younger, and they've done immeasurable harm to society. I hold this power in society, and I've used it to do bad things. Meaning now, men now understand that the place of women, that struggles women go through in society. Feminists can now push for a more visceral topic compared to what you have on our bench. Men are now seeing the real damage or physical harms women have had because of patriarchy, because of the government in their country. The direct impact of this, that we push for accountability on a micro level. The average man now understands what the position in society is. They understand what the patriarchy is compared to what you had in the past. The patriarchy has done immeasurable damage to Peruvian women. This isn't seen on the comparative. Why is this the case? Because, once again, the idea of sexual health clinics, the idea of these modern ideas, is a very, very fringe idea in the majority of Roman Catholic countries. The average Roman Catholic who goes to church on a Sunday will not buy into ideas of religious freedom, physical and sexual liberation, because they don't really care about it. It's not proximate to them. On the comparative, our ideas are proximate to people. We see physical harms amongst your brothers and sisters. This is what the main change is. I'll take the POI.
It's weird to me that you are arguing that this is the best way for people to see how the patriarchy commits harms on women when there are active stories where the patriarchy does this right now to thousands across the globe.
Okay, once again, the average Peruvian doesn't care. The Peruvian people don't care about an abortion story in North America. The Peruvian people care if your guy, if the person who looks like you in the village was abused by the government. That's what's visceral to you. That's what you care about. You don't care about fringe stories from across the world. You care about what's happening in your country by your government, by people you voted for. Stuff you can see physically and stuff you can see personally. Lastly, there's a resource trade-off in the movement itself. Very importantly, you cannot campaign for both at the exact same time, meaning that you want to do stuff while you still have the capacity to do so. I hope I didn't mention this, but I didn't explain what the resource trade-off is. Very importantly, a movement such as the feminist one is very, very small in Catholic countries. It's very limited amounts of funding. Now, because of this resource trade-off, you cannot push for both issues at the same time. The main change you have on our side is that you push all your resources into this one issue. You push all your resources into this one very much easier thing to campaign for. You don't have to get insane levels of constitutional change. You like to get large levels of legal change, but even if you don't, you can change people's opinions on a micro level. People are better off on our side. Very proud to propose.
Cool. So I thank the member of government for a fine speech. But member of opposition to commence the case of closing opposition whenever they're ready.
Hello.
Hello.
A harm has been done, and that's terrible, but we agree with OO. We'd rather stop more harms existing for the millions of women in Peru. 4 extensions. Firstly, why is the government less likely to grant reproductive rights, and why is that necessary for government? Why reproductive rights require far less state intervention on our side of the house? Then a few more analyticals on buy-in, why you can convince conservative women on our side of the house, and then why you get far more overall funding for the movement. Why will the government not support this and not establish this on Gov side of the house? 2 independent mechanisms. Firstly, existing governmental and donor networks are built upon people who've taken part in the harm. They act as advisors from other people within the party. They're still high up and can influence between who can run or not within specific individual parties. Even if they're not in the parties, party networks are often complex and build upon these things like information and alliances, individual friendship, professional alliances, but they also have significant amounts of influence as to who can run and who can even be a part of these parties in the first place. Secondarily, it's incredibly practically difficult, which I think is why they established this. People don't want to say it was them, so it creates cycles of blame, high amounts of governmental cover-ups. Notably, this could also decrease the access you might have towards these documents in the first place. Officials getting rid of evidence, fudging more numbers. I mean, in the future, if you want to establish these operations, you even have less control than you may even have now. Why is government reliant on state intervention? Firstly, the harm that was done by the state. Therefore, the only real argument that can be forwarded is one via state involvement within the specific place or the institution of the state, especially if we want to claim their best benefits of things like reparations. Secondarily, reparations that are necessary have to be done on large scales, significant amounts of money or large amounts of movement of land being able to be given back. Thirdly, they require coordination from different state services, the judiciary, the civil bureaucracy, the legislature to be able to enforce this. Why are we far less reliant on governmental structures? 1, we can create smaller internal feminist networks of health and redistribution. We can do things like having systems of illegal doctors who are able to provide abortions to other individuals, redistribution of birth pills and condoms within smaller local towns. We can teach people safer sex practices and teach communities how to teach these things further. It doesn't matter if no one comes. We can just have the place open for them, drop these drop boxes, and when people want to use them, they come in and use them, or they know someone who might use them. Secondarily, we can do individual levels of litigation or pushback against individual abuses of companies being discriminatory or individual men who do things like rape. These men have less money. They have, and a collectivized force of feminist individuals can do things like establish precedent within courts, such that if it means like a woman said yes and then later she ended up saying no, these things are able to be carried on to benefit future women by creating these precedents against individual men. Thirdly, we can do more efficacious protests. So things like 4B, not having sex with men. Each woman within the movement individually has a higher sphere of change in their own life than government is able to have, because government have to appeal towards external people. We can appeal towards people who we just know by closely. Notably, this is a claim non-reliant on buying. Even if we keep the same amount of feminists, the feminists who are involved are able to do more than what they're aiming to do than government are ever able to establish, meaning that we're still able to provide more benefit even if nothing else in the debate changes. But it also shows our benefits are more scalar. We don't have to achieve a policy flip, we just have to increase more access to abortions or more access to condoms, which I think we're far more able to do. Why couldn't we appeal towards conservative women? Notably, opening government say women are conservative, so the closing government say that. I say, I think women will be able to deal with it. 4 independent reasons why conservative women will be able to buy in. Firstly, conservatives have a variety of different beliefs. And notably, they say that even if they can't be used for them, religious institutions often carry on things like rights to privacy. So you still get like economic FDI benefits you're able to appeal towards too, but you're also able to appeal towards things like less spending on healthcare because less women are going to be able to die in childbirth now, so that some women who are perhaps more fiscally conservative might be able to flip. Secondarily, we have religious networks, and notably South America does have people who support like things like abortion coming in from other nations. So Roman Catholics or feminist Catholics from other areas of South America were able to do things like cross-coordination, or even just things like feminist Catholics that exist within Peru currently were able to appeal towards things within priesthoods or within individual classes in a way that government aren't able to do so because they have less indigenous like Catholics to be able to appeal to, right? Thirdly, women are sympathetic about autonomy. They can emotionally rationalize and see what it's like to be forced to be having children. Therefore, you're still able to relate to someone else even if you are not in the particular position. But fourthly, Peru has had a really radical switch to the left in recent years, or so does most of South America as a whole, due to the level of pink tide that has been coming in, which means general leftist narratives have been spread more and more people are aware of those narratives. Why do we get far more funding on opposition? And notably, this also increases the scale of media attention, increases how much resources they have and how much benefits we're able to provide. But before that, opening.
I explained in DPM that the current political momentum and coverage means opposition parties have incentive to work with you to gain power and indigenous vote, which also builds political capital for the feminist movement in the long term.
So firstly, you are dependent upon those parties believing that it's a high level of voter changes they're actually going to influence it. Secondarily, you're influenced on these reparations being consistently happening by other parties in the long term. So even if one party institutes it now, why will the next party continue on these reparations going forward? These are claims that are structural, long-termist. You have to prove why it's going to lead to that larger level of shift. You've proven perhaps you get more attention, but not that politicians actually change the way they end up voting or regarding their own citizens. Why do we get far more funding on opposition side of the House? Notably, this also increases our benefits that we're able to claim as to why we're non-reliant on governmental intervention, and we're still able to provide more benefits just by achieving this more funding. Firstly, we have more funding and coordinations from feminists abroad. Notably, government issues are specific to things like indigenous harms, and we agree there are other indigenous harms that have happened across the world, but like very simply, there are more feminist institutions who are able to coordinate and benefit with us insofar as every country has feminist institutions, not every country has indigenous harms that we prepared for. These are pre-existing networks that know how to coordinate. Specific loans you're able to achieve, how you can access laws. I also note reproductive rights and establishing of contemporary sex laws have been more successful than a lot of indigenous reparations have been. So the information that we get is also more likely to be successful in terms of how you're able to coordinate at even lower level of individual networking or even larger levels of government institutional control. Secondarily, corporations and larger institutions are more willing to support or fund our policies. This is because things like birth rights, reproductive rights are directly correlated with having more things in the workforce, accessing more labor. A lot of corporations do fund these things directly, but you're also able to appeal towards global institutions like the IMF, who are partial towards these policies insofar as they establish larger levels of human rights claims. So you're able to appeal towards larger governmental institutions, and you're also able to make a claim towards other political institutions within government as to why, if they institute this, they're also able to access far more capital, such that we're going to have far more funding from these specific bodies. But thirdly, we have more funding from feminists internally. A rich feminist paying for the abortion that she gets in a larger city creates things like economies of scale that these feminists internally are able to benefit off of. It's also easier to collect charity and appeal towards them because you're able to put money in. You're able to give $5 that another person is able to benefit a condom of. You're not able to give $5 that then actually results in the reparations that end up happening. By the end of closing opposition, I think we have far better proven buy-in, but I don't even think buy-in matters. We have proven funding from individuals who care, and that funding being able to be distributed to individuals who need it the most, which we think is far more scalar and far more certain than anything else people have proven. Closing opposition.
So I thank the member of opposition for a fine speech. The member of opposition bench. Go off whip whenever you're ready.
Am I clearly audible?
And visible, yeah.
I agree with CO. I don't think buy-in really matters insofar as you never got to the constitutional or like the changes in this debate in the first place. I'm going to directly respond to CO's kind of context in this round. The first thing they say is that you can have illegal abortion clinics. No, this requires specialist doctors, people who are trained to carry out abortions, who do not have the training on, like in the status quo, right? So, and secondly, obviously there's not going to be trust in illegal, like abortion clinics. This is quite dumb. But secondly, they say that there's going to be individual pushback against sterilizers on their side of the house. But I will note this: poor Peruvian communities, they do not have capital to prosecute high-ranking people. They do not have the legitimacy to do so. I genuinely don't think you can do this unless it is backed by the government and by the feminist movement. Okay, let's talk about accountability. So the op bench claim is that it won't work. They give two main reasons. The first was that it's very expensive to do so. I would note that the financial cost is symmetric on both sides. It's also very expensive to set up thousands of abortion clinics, to train specialized doctors, to pay them extra salaries, to import them from other companies, to implement sex ed schemes and different education. It's really expensive on both sides. But on our side, it's a short-term change. You give reparations today. In the long term, on their side, you need to maintain these clinics. You need to maintain all these things. Secondly, they say that politicians don't want to be prosecuted in the future. Firstly, politicians are probably constantly changing, and via the CO mechanism that the second pink tide wave governments are coming in, they're liberal, they're probably not that conservative. But I'm going to flip this. I think there's a massive political incentive to implement this for two reasons. The first is that there are hundreds of thousands of families who are now backing the feminist accountability movement. The reason why is, as David explained, they are watching the families being permanently harmed. Their lineage is being destroyed, and like certain women in that family have not had children. You weaken the family trees. And the reason as to why this is important is because when the feminist movement is now backing this, they're gaining widespread support across multiple poorest Peruvian regions who are now backing this, who are changing their voting behaviors, who are now more likely to vote for politicians who actively try and preach for things such as accountability. I think that's very important. But secondly, I think that politicians can just claim an easy win if they do this. They say that, well, the way that we differentiate ourselves is like, we're doing this for the families, we're doing this for reparations. The comparative is politicians are very unlikely to implement constitutional changes for women. Why is this? Two reasons. Firstly, in changing the constitution is very hard. Oftentimes, it's embedded in the constitution that women do not have these reproductive rights, that politicians have to consult the writers of these constitutions, that they have to all come into a 2/3 majority agreement within all of these spaces. And yes, even if some votes happen within these constitutions, it's just very hard to rewrite. I don't think you get enough backing. But secondly, as David explained, it's seen as a really detached thing. So I don't think you get this support from the ground in the first place. The feminist movement doesn't directly link all of these new rights to the fact that the women in the past have been sterilized. Yeah, there's some link, but there's much less. On our side, we garner sympathy by showing people, the feminist movement shows all of the harms done to women, therefore necessitating reparations. We change behaviors amongst people on the ground. We actually implement sympathy. We get family support. support. Next, why is reproductive rights for women probably in the long term going to naturally solve itself in Peru, or to some degree it's going to do so? Firstly, you have external bodies such as the UN using soft power tactics. Look at the UN literally doing all these things already. The UN is pushing for things such as more rights to women. Look at how literally in Peru, women are gaining voting. Women are gaining all of these rights in the first place. I think the Peru have incentive to follow the UN so that they can be seen as more internationally legitimate, to be seen as constantly progressing, to be seen as good. The comparative is the IMF has never prosecuted like government officials, or like they're very unlikely to do so because of the ramifications they might pull out. I'm not sure as to why. Secondly, religion in Peru is probably already in the next few years probably going to like reform as well. Look at the Catholic Church is relatively now relaxing. Pope Leo pushing for all these reforms. I think over time we're probably going to get these reproductive rights anyway. The implication then is that the feminist movement wastes its resources on something that is happening organically, and in doing so they are not giving reparations to families. We fill out that missing burden from our opening. The next thing I want to do is respond to opening opposition. They say the reproductive rights are like going to make more buy-in from women on the ground and intensify their contributions. They do not have an impact. If their impact is women care about the movement, like what are they going to do? They're just going to show up to one or two more protests. Like I'm unclear as to what the end goal of that kind of argument was in the first place. But secondly, I genuinely think women support the movement on both sides. I think buy-in is relatively symmetric. The reason why is because women seek to benefit from both sides of the house. On our side, they seek to benefit because you're actively protecting their family lineage. On their side, they're now gaining like empowerment through all of these proposed laws that are being changing. The difference is we prove from CG that these changes are actually going to happen, whereas on their side, it's really hard to pass all of these constitutional reforms, whereas on our side, you get much more widespread sympathy, you get more awareness about the mistreatment of women. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Yeah, this constitutional reform thing is a straw man. Our case is also about sex education, contraceptives, and discrimination protections, which will get far quicker, particularly if you're correct and Catholicism is relaxing in Peru.
The problem is, David already explained as to why all of these pushing things for such as sex ed is really hard, because men oppose these things in Peru, right? They're much less likely to back for these things, to vote for these things, because look, it doesn't really benefit them. Whereas on our side, men are in families which have been harmed by sterilization. They're much more likely to change their voting behaviors. There's more of a political incentive on our side to do these types of things. Secondly, I genuinely think that like opening opposition then. Okay, what do they say? They say like, there's going to be more buy-in. Buy-in's probably a wash, as I just explained. But our case was a prerequisite to buy-in in the first place. The reason why is because we prove why this is going to work, why accountability is probably more likely to succeed, which means we reach that end outcome of buy-in for them, because if something succeeds, even if the feminist movement achieves some reparations, they do not have to have all reparations across the entire country. Even if they do have some, women feel much more empowered now that the movement is actually achieving something for them, which is very, very important. And also, I don't think they proved that principle. The next thing I want to do is address CO. They say you get more conservative buy-in. Like, probably not, right? Like, loads of like conservatives probably have fixed views like, the patriarchy is good. Like, we probably need all of these things. I'm generally unclear as to why they're going to buy into reparations. Whereas we explain as to why this is uniquely the way that we unlock change and we unlock all these things. Proud to CG.
Cool. Let's thank the government whip for a fine speech. Conclude the debate. Opposition whip whenever they're ready.
Cool. 2 seconds. Before you ask, yes, we're in a bathroom. It's a long story. Don't worry about it. Okay. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about buy-in. Then I'm going to talk about how we're able to have more localized change. And then I'm just going to weigh off, if both things are able to be achieved, which one we prefer being achieved in the first instance. On buy-in, and I think this is where top half ends up becoming very difficult to adjudicate, because both of them give reasons as to why one thing might be more likely than the other. And it's very unclear like which of these is actually more likely to happen. Govbench as a whole has 3 reasons as to why they get more buy-in. From opening government, it's on momentum. They say that this has already happened in some court cases, so we can continue to use that momentum. Like, why can't we use the momentum that exist because of that court case to channel it into other ways of producing feminism or like producing feminist ends as well, right? So it's very unclear why that momentum is asymmetric to only be able to do things like achieve more like reparations for women in other instances, and why you can't channel that same momentum into also talking about other ways in which women can be benefited, in which a feminist agenda can be pushed. Given the lack of analysis here, I'm not really sure that this is a plausible like reason for this. Closing government has two new mechanisms for this. Firstly, about men being more willing to like donate to causes or liking causes that they were also harmed by. The main issue that I have with this case is it's very unclear from their analysis why people genuinely resonate more with Indigenous people or poor people than they do like with their own situations, right? Because presumably, yes, you have men that exist under their side and maybe not under our side, but those were very, very poor men. Those were men that existed in Indigenous circles, which were often minority groups that are structurally left out of a lot of society. They were structurally more isolated in geographical areas. So I'm not sure why your average man in Peru genuinely resonates more with an Indigenous man than they would with the woman that they married or the sister that they might have in a city. So I just don't think that there's an asymmetry in terms of the amount to which you are able to like detach yourselves or relate to these things. The other reason they give is that there's sort of visceral imaging that you're able to have about like babies being taken away and things like that, and that's very visceral. The thing here is, and I think this is like a really damning issue for GovBench, is I think the way that people react to atrocities that have happened to them when it comes to sterilization is to think about the way that the state intervened on their bodies and to think about the fact that maybe states just shouldn't have that much control over anyone's body ever. It's not necessarily think that the way that they sterilize you is bad, but like the specific way that in which the state operates by having that much control over you is a harmful thing, which I think is why we're able to unlock a lot more conservative women under our side of the house too, because you're able to tap into their ideas of things like bodily autonomy being infringed on by a different entity, an entity that you might not necessarily have voted for, an entity that is like out with your own home, an entity that isn't necessarily religious by itself, and actively attacking your ability to choose what you want over your own body. So I think that you probably are still able to have very visceral imaging that still taps into the same Indigenous communities, because you're still able to resonate with the fact that their bodily autonomy was taken away in the same way that women's autonomy is stripped when they are not able to access things like free abortion and free healthcare then. So I just don't think they have much of a margin then on the buy-in. We're down wins this clash in two ways. The first is explaining why conservative women buy in more, per the analysis I just said about why the autonomy rationale also exists for conservative women. This is really important because opening opposition, to their credit, don't really give analysis why conservative women uniquely are able to buy in more onto their side of the house. They say things like it's your most proximate need and you care about it because you can like think that because you can conceptualize it happening to you. The problem with this is that this presumes that you already have somewhat of a left-wing bias and that you already somewhat support feminism, or you already somewhat have an idea of like wanting to advance women's rights. Given that the top half frame is that most societies are very conservative and that there are predominantly people that are like religiously Catholic, it's very unclear why they're able to have a unique tipping point then to have more people buy in, which would be your more traditionally conservative women, absent Rodin's analysis on this. But the second way Rodin wins this clash is just by explaining why money is a tipping point to being able to access most of the things that top half talks about. Obviously, things like reparations are expensive, and I don't think GovBench is able to solve for the fact that they have to devote a significant amount of funding to this. But comparatively, I think what Rodin tells you is that you're able to have women donate to specific causes whereby women are able to benefit from those causes under our side of the house. So you're able to give money, for example, to a doctor who then is able to perform an abortion on another woman. You're able to give money to a charity that then is giving out contraception to women in Indigenous and rural communities. And that is actively a way in which you're able to benefit these people. So if states are unwilling to fund these types of programs, then you're able to use more localized, more individual funding under our side of the house, which is the way in which you're able to create that big change that they want to talk about. The last thing that GovBench says on this is about backlash. They say that this is like, this is very unlikely that people like don't like these types of changes. I think that realistically there's some amount of backlash to either type of policy that exists here. I think there's just significantly more backlash when you have to take accountability for the atrocities that have happened to you, when that's going to be something that is written in your history books for years and years to come, that you have to teach your children about, that you have to own up to your own mistakes. There is significantly less backlash when you, for example, allow abortion up to the 8-week mark, which has significantly less harm on you, and therefore I think realistically we're able to win on the buy-in clash then. Second clash then, on the localized change stuff, and this is I think where we're most cleanly able to weigh over what opening opposition say. They say a lot of their policies are big, and like to their credit, they give a very good analysis as to explain why it's important for women to be able to access contraception and abortions and things like that. And that's genuinely beautiful analysis. My issue here is that does rely on states being the ones to implement that change in the first instance. And given that both teams agree that like that might not happen and states might just not do anything, even if the feminist movement advocates for a specific thing, it's very unclear the margin of their claim, right? They would need to explain why the state does in fact do the policies that they do, why the state does put abortion clinics in every city, and I am genuinely unclear from opening opposition's analysis why that is the case. Our case then fills in this gap because it explains why on a localized level, women are more likely able to access the benefits that are existing under our side than reparations. Because individual women cannot give out reparations to other individual women, but they can do things like refer you to a doctor that can give you an abortion, do things like have local community centres that advocate for women's ability to be able to have things like contraception, educate women in small localized centres about sex and the correct ways to go about having sex and to be able to use protection, which means we think we're better able to unlock the analysis to explain why there's actually some level of change. The way that Rodan does this is firstly by explaining the funding that you're directly able to trickle into these localized areas. But secondly, just by explaining why these localized areas are able to be successful. Closing government's responses to this are abortion clinics would be illegal and people don't trust in these things from opening government. The problem with this is obviously there are some doctors that are willing to perform abortions in some instances because they weigh off the risk calculus, but there are also other ways you can do things that aren't illegal, like giving out contraception, giving out the pill. That doesn't require you to for example, give up your medical license. That just requires you to be making small sacrifices to educate women, for example. And on the trust claim from opening government, we then flip this claim, right? Because presumably you trust your own local institutions and your own localized women far more than you would a state giving you money, for example, or a state intervening on your part, which is how we're able to then flip their trust claim to explain why women do trust these services enough to utilize them in really effective ways. The last thing I want to do then is just explain on weighing why this is the most important thing in the round. Firstly, we should protect people that could be harmed into the future. There is an inordinate number of women that will be harmed by not being able to access abortion. Yes, the harms have been committed to women in the past, but given that there are more harms that we can committed in the future, we ought to weigh on the potential harms that can be committed into the future. Lastly, on reparations, they are not proportional to the harms that have been suffered. We ought to do something that is proportional, which is alleviate suffering that can happen, which is why we are very proud to stand in closing opposition and win this debate. Thank you.
Cool. I'd like to thank Opposition Whip for a fine speech. All the best. It's been a great debate. See you around. Please leave the room. My God, actually, people left the room very quickly. That's novel. Are both of you still happy to have the panel discussion recorded? You can obviously say no if you would prefer not to.
Mildly not to. I'm sorry to be a pain.
No,
I
that's
see how this
okay.
could be useful. Sorry to be annoying.
No. You're perfectly in your rights to do so.